Hello everyone. Today is Thursday, May 7th, 2026, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, The Political Report. For today's video, I wanted to go over the key takeaways from the Indiana primary election and the Ohio primary elections that happened 2 nights ago. So here you can see on your screen was probably the biggest result from the night, as you can see here, as reported by CNN, that Trump ultimately did end up getting revenge on all of the Indiana State Senate lawmakers who decided to go against the party and go against Donald Trump when it came to redistricting. So for a little bit of a history lesson for those who don't remember, back at the end of 2025 at the national mid-decade redistricting push where Trump was meeting with Indiana lawmakers, constantly pressuring them, sending J.D. Vance to visit them in their home state of Indiana, and Trump inviting them to the White House multiple times for rounds of talks, the Indiana State Senate lawmakers ended up siding with the Democrats, in which 21 of Indiana's Republican senators joined all 10 of the Democrats in voting down the redistricting proposal. In the state where the GOP was planning to go for a 9-0 map, from the current 7-2 map favoring the GOP, but only having 2 Democrats, they were going for a full and total sweep at 9-0. However, you can actually see here that the majority of the Republicans, that being 21 of the 40, so a bit of a slight majority of all of the Republicans, actually joined and sided with all the Democrats, and a rebuke of the administration's push for redistricting nationwide and specifically in Indiana. Going off what I just said, if you remember, 21 of these Indiana Republicans voted no and voted with all of the Democrats. Interestingly enough, of the 21, 10 of them were up for re-election. You can see here that on the primary, with the 10 being up for re-election, 2 actually ended up retiring, therefore giving up their re-election bid, stopping themselves from being primaried by an outsider or a Trump-aligned candidate. Since they have already dropped out, Trump did not need to formally back a primary challenger, as whatever Republican was going to take the candidate's place had already pledged to be pro-redistricting and pro-Trump for the GOP in that district. So before the primaries even started, Trump was able to stop the career of 2 Indiana state senator lawmakers. If you recall, the vote ended up failing 31-19, which means that Trump only needs to flip 6 seats or convince 6 Republicans to vote yes. And if he is able to convince 6 Republicans to vote yes, or primary out, or force 6 Republicans into retirement until they are replaced by a more Trump-aligned GOP candidate, forcing them to vote yes, Trump only needs a 25-25 vote in the Indiana Senate. And with the tie, Indiana's GOP government can break the tiebreaker with a Trump-aligned GOP official, therefore breaking the tie and allowing Republicans to go full pedal to the metal and go for a complete 9-0 sweep in the state. So going into the takeaways, Trump had already won 2 of the seats because the candidates retired, as I just mentioned, leaving him with 4 remaining seats in which he needed to get revenge on by primarying out the incumbent senator. And as this CNN article points out, Trump got exactly what he wanted, if not way more. It goes into how Trump made all of these endorsements, and a lot of Republicans and more so Democrats nationwide were saying that Trump has lost his grip on the party, that the Republican Party is failing, they're rebuking Trump, the GOP is falling apart, and they're leaving Trump at record numbers. However, the opposite seems to be the case in Indiana, where Trump was able to successfully primary the majority, if not nearly all, of the senators who refused to redistrict and he found primary challengers for. A lot of this was supported by the fact that the GOP got a lot of financial spending against these incumbent Indiana senators, where outside groups like Turning Point USA and Turning Point Action were working hand in hand with the Trump administration to ruin the chances of these incumbent GOP senators for what Trump saw as a betrayal to the Republican Party, because many of them refused to do what the Republican constituents want. Now, a lot of the Democrats looked at these races saying that the incumbents are right for not helping Trump, that they're doing what their constituents want, and that the Republicans in Indiana were leaving Trump at record pace so that these incumbents were just supporting what their district wants. However, that cannot be further from the truth. As we can go here, we can actually go and see the results live from the New York Times for the races that have been called. Going directly to the state legislature elections, you can actually see that New York Times has a tracker for the Trump endorsements he made in the state Senate. So as mentioned, Trump had 10 senators who voted against him on this re-election cycle. You can see here that the New York Times has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 trackers in which the incumbent who opposed redistricting had a challenger that was funded and endorsed by Donald Trump running against the incumbent Republican senator, who Trump and the Republican Party as a national whole has labeled as RINOs for refusing to do what the Republican base wants. And you may be wondering, why is there only 7 candidates here? Did he not just say that there have been 10 senators who voted against Trump? That's because, as mentioned, 2 of them retired, leaving 1 senator left, and that's actually the senator from the 17th Republican district, where you can see Senator McKinley actually also got primaried out by GOP challenger Parker, where Parker ended up beating the incumbent by a little bit more than 4 percentage points. Now, this is also noteworthy because McKinley voted against Donald Trump and was labeled as a RINO. However, Trump backed down from a full endorsement of Parker, and Parker did not receive the majority of the fundraising and primary funds that many of these other races that had more attention actually ended up getting. But despite this, the Trump-aligned candidate Parker here actually beat another incumbent quote-unquote RINO, as Trump would label him, in McKinley. So out of the 10 seats, you can see here that Trump automatically won 2 from retirement, and he only needs 6, so he won 2 from retirement. He has his 3rd right here, where Trump's challenger, DeVries, actually ended up winning by more than a 52-point margin, which is interesting because a lot of these Republican senators who opposed redistricting were saying that they were doing what their constituents want, that the Republicans are parties of principles and morality, and that even though this redistricting would give them an advantage, that their constituents are more principled and moral, and therefore they did not want them to redraw, which is why they refused. But as mentioned, you can see here from the 52-point margin that cannot be further from the truth, where all the Republicans in the district essentially seem pretty aligned with Trump and never actually supported these senators and are getting their revenge along with Trump here on his revenge tour. Because you can see here 23% for an incumbent, a decades-old incumbent in the state Senate, is frankly tragic considering he lost by 52 percentage points. And I also believe this was an open primary, and a lot of Democrats were actually going to the voting primaries and voting for the Republicans to vote for all the RINOs. So out of this 23%, the majority of these numbers are also probably registered Democrats. So the true number for Republican support for Trump is probably even higher. Back to what I was saying, he already had 2 districts won from retirement. He has his 3rd right here, his 4th right there, his 5th right there, and his 6th in the 21st district. So just off these first 6 alone, Trump has enough of a mandate in Indiana now in the state Senate for the following year, probably once these new senators are inaugurated, to push for a 9-0 Indiana redistricting map, as Trump will now have a 25-25 vote, assuming the votes stay the same, which I believe that they will, if not more Republicans will fall in line because they see what happened to their companions here who voted against Trump. But furthermore, we see that there is one race that is going to a recount that's tied at 50-50. We'll get into that in a little bit. But there is one race where incumbent Republican Senator Greg Good ended up winning at 54% to 36. Now, this is because there was also a 3rd Trump-aligned candidate who ended up taking a lot of the votes, accumulating to around 10% of the votes extra for pro-redistricting. So really, instead of this 18-point margin, it's closer to an 8% margin. But moving back to this, Greg Good was actually one of the few Republicans who had a lot of sympathy for him in this race. That's because Greg Good was actually the victim of a swatting attack hours after Trump branded him as a RINO in the district for refusing to comply with the redistricting. Now, Greg Good was able to spin this situation into his benefit and ended up getting a lot of sympathy from a lot of Republican voters who thought Trump may have been going too far, at least in his district, and a lot of Republicans actually decided to back Good and continue with him as their senator because of this. Additionally, it was reported that Greg Good was one of the only GOP senators who actually had a town hall and a convention within his district to get his voters' opinion on the redistricting before he actually voted. So he's one of the few GOP senators where he said that he was doing the bidding of his constituents, which seems to be true here considering he just won his re-election. Moving back down to the 41st district, you can see that Davis beat Walker by 18 percentage points, and back to the 17th, that the Republican Parker ended up beating the incumbent McKinley by around 4 percentage points as well. So out of the 10 seats, it looks like Trump has pretty much won 8 of the 10 seats, with 1 going to a recount and 1 being an official loss where Greg Good has won. So Trump has an actual comfortable margin in the Indiana State Senate to pursue redistricting in the next year. So I presume that there will be no opposition left against Donald Trump and the Republican Party from going for a complete 9-0 gerrymander in the state of Indiana, which is going to further cost Democrats another 2 House seats. However, the saving grace for them is that this will be for the 2028 House elections, not for the 2026 elections, as that term has already passed. Moving forward to the other results of the night, we had the Ohio primary elections. So for the Ohio primary elections, the Republican primary was not really that competitive. A lot of online Republicans and people who are very interested and included within the online political sphere on social media and other pundit accounts were actually backing Republican Casey Push instead of Vivek Ramaswamy, because they feel as though Vivek Ramaswamy is not as aligned with the Republican Party. For those who recall, Vivek Ramaswamy was actually kicked out of Doge in the Trump administration very early on to Trump's inauguration, because of tweets and support Vivek Ramaswamy has made on his Twitter account, where he has supported mass migration, mass Indian immigration, and has criticized American culture time after time on his Twitter account. Which, regardless of what your opinion may be, saying that to a majority Republican audience, specifically living in Republican plus 11 Ohio, is sort of a dumb thing for Vivek to say, at least from a PR and media standpoint. And because of this, he ended up drawing a challenger here in Casey Push. Now, Casey Push had virtually no money or real name recognition in the state. He had a lot of online fabricated support, where a lot of people who just hated Vivek were saying that Vivek was going to underperform in a landslide. However, Vivek ended up winning 82.5% of the vote and winning by over a 65% margin. So although there were two candidates here for the Ohio gubernatorial race, this wasn't really as competitive as many may have thought. Then for the Democrats, Amy Acton won uncontested as expected because she had no opponents, and Sherrod Brown ended up winning with nearly 90% of the vote against another no-name candidate as expected. The interesting thing here, I think, would be the total vote count, because in reality, none of these races received high name recognition, none of these races enthused massive primary turnout, none of these races were competitive. All of these were basically a shoo-in for the Republican and the Democrat candidate, when in reality there was virtually no competition for Democrats or for Republicans here in the primary. So there was no motivation or enthusiasm for Democrats to show out versus Republicans to show out, rather than their overall approval of the Trump administration or their overall approval of the Republican or Democrat primary. So those who decided to show up and vote in the primary are those who are still actively involved with Republican politics, or those who are still actively involved with Democrat politics. It's not because they had a burden or a obligation to go turn out because of a close race. So that's why I think these primary voter numbers are so important. Over 817,000 Republicans voted in the governor primary. Comparing that to the U.S. Senate Democratic primary, you can see that over 790,000 Democrats ended up voting in that primary, which leads to an approximate difference or delta of 26,000 Republican voters who exceeded the number of Democrat voters who showed up at this election day to vote in these races. Why is this important? As many people and political pundits project, they think that this gubernatorial race in November will be a very close neck-and-neck race. The same thing goes for the U.S. Senate election here for John Ousted versus Sherrod Brown. However, I think that these numbers are reassuring for Republicans, because Republicans can come out and argue saying, hey, our voter turnout was over 26,000 more than the Democrats showed up to turn out. And Republicans really have no reason to turn out. Trump is at the lowest approval of his current administration, whereas Democrats are at the highest polling they've had in the generic ballot so far since the Trump administration began. So really, all of the momentum for the midterms are on the Democrats' side, and Republicans are sort of at a valley or a low point right now during the Trump administration. So if all things being equal, because there's no competitive primaries in the state, you would think that Republicans should be underperforming here, which to a degree is true, because as mentioned, this is a Republican plus 11 state. So you would think, okay, 11% more Republicans show up. But if you really look at the numbers here, 26,000 Republicans is probably closer to maybe 3 to 5% excess Republicans showing up compared to the typical 11%. But even with that being said, the fact that Republicans are outvoting Democrats in the primary in Ohio, and Democrats are supposed to be the party of college-educated voters, young voters, the very educated voters who know everything about the political process and voting, getting your early vote, your provisional ballot, your mail-in ballot, and virtually every other knowledge statistic on their side when it comes to their base showing up. The Republicans on the rural side of the state are the most low propensity voters, where Republicans, as you see time and time again in all these elections, are not voting in mass for these primaries or these special elections, and they are only turning out at the high propensity elections in November or for the presidential race. So the fact that the raw numbers show Republicans actually turning out in a higher amount than the Democrats is a decent sign for the Republicans here, with all else being equal. Now, of course, this is just one observation and one statistic and is not a prediction for the November general election. However, you have to admit that these primary voter turnout statistics is at least manageable for the Republicans and not good news for Democrats. Where you can say that these voter turnout numbers don't matter because it wasn't competitive. We all know that if Democrats ended up outvoting Republicans here by 50,000, that would have been doomsday for Republicans in the GOP, and the Democrats would be a shoo-in for November. But because they did not out-turn out the Republicans here, this is just another day as normal in Ohio because they have the advantage, and it seems that they're keeping the advantage when it comes to turnout. So I just think that's something interesting and should be pointed out for when it comes to the November general election. Finally, I wanted to end off with the Ohio 9th Congressional District primary results. So out of the whole state of Ohio, at least on the Republican side, the only primary that ended up being somewhat competitive or interesting was Ohio's 9th Congressional District. And this is because 2024 nominee Derek Marin was actually running for the nomination once again to get a rematch against Marcy Kaptur. Now, Marcy Kaptur beat Marin by around 4 percentage points in 2024 in a heavily Trump district. For those of you who paid attention to redistricting, you know that Marcy Kaptur's district has actually become even more Republican than it was last time, making her chances of re-election slim to none, depending on the Democratic environment here. So the fact that the Republicans were able to go with a candidate that they felt as though just came a little bit short and he's running again, with all else being equal, just off the redistricting, he should be able to win. But of course, the Democrats' momentum and national environment might be enough for Marcy Kaptur to keep the ball rolling on her side. But there is one sign of worry for her here. You can see here that the Republicans amassed 57,000 votes here in the competitive Republican primary. However, Marcy Kaptur, being a 30-year incumbent, was only able to get 39,000 votes in the primary. Now, of course, the main difference here is that the Democratic primary was not competitive, whereas the Republican primary was competitive. But as mentioned before, the Democrats are the most college educated. They are the highest propensity voters. They show up for every single election to vote for their candidate no matter what. As a blanket generalization and assumption, you would expect them to be doing better here. However, they did fall around 18,000 votes short compared to how many Republicans got. Now, of course, I don't actually think that Democrats are going to lose by this wide of a margin, but I just do think it's interesting that Republicans do seem to have high turnout in Ohio for a primary, whereas the Democrats have not. That pretty much sums up my video here on the Indiana and Ohio state primary elections. If you enjoyed the video, click subscribe down below and don't forget to leave a like on the video. If you have any topics or future videos you want me to consider, please go ahead and leave it down below in a comment, and if it's something interesting, I might do it as a topic for a future video. With that being said, everyone, I hope you all have a good rest of your day, and I will see you all later this week.